Welcome to Soulful. Whether you're navigating challenges or celebrating victories,
We're here to remind you that every step on your path is meaningful. I'm Tiff.
and I'm Jess.
So let's clear our mind as we fill our soul.
So welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Soulful. I'm Jess, and as always, I'm here with Tiff.
Hi.
So we're just stepping out of the holidays and into a new year. So I'm wishing each and every one of you all of the things that you need or you want for 2025. And we'll already be a couple of months into it by the time that you get by the time you're tuning into this episode. So I do hope that it's off to the start that you'd hoped for. So I guess let's do a check-in. I know if that this time of year I guess can be stressful and magical and lonely and abundant all of the things at once. So recognizing that space, I guess, that we're navigating, that we're in right now, that we're just coming out of over the holidays. What is one highlight that you have from the past couple of weeks?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and it is. There's so many things that come through this season, emotionally and otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One highlight. I mean, there were a few, but I'm surprised to say this, but it is what's coming to top of mind. So, on Christmas Eve, I went to a church for Christmas, and I hadn't been to church in, oh my gosh, I can't tell you how long, having grown up in church myself. But the music was a 10 out of 10, and the connection level in that space,
Mm-hmm.
um, just off the charts. So welcoming and open. And like I said, the music was really good. So it was really easy to enjoy it with Christmas carols and things like that. So it was a very unexpected highlight and I loved it. Yeah, it was great. What about you?
Nice. Yeah, same. Like I feel like I have had a lot of highlights. Yeah, I'm grateful for those. I think if I was to pick one, um, it probably would be that I have been, I guess, forced into some deep reflection around just self and most importantly, connection. And yeah, I really didn't necessarily plan on doing that during one of the busiest times of the year for me. But yeah, I guess in between spending like 75% of the month away and the almost, I think it was like 300 cookies that I made and all of the gift wrapping. And anyways, I will say that, yeah, the space for considering what I need connection in my life to look like, I guess,
Mm.
has been a highlight. And eating some of those 300 cookies too, I guess, as well.
What's your like favorite flavor that you've made?
My favorite, oh, that's a hard one. So as a kid, like during Christmas or even like, gathering and all of that stuff, there's all of these different kinds of cookies. And so you get to pick your favorite. The thing I've realized about being an adult is that I only have to make my favorites. It's like, yeah, that's so they were all really good. My favorite one though is we call it a Smartie cookie. It's kind of like similar to like the Newfoundland Snowball. It's like a little bit different, but it has like the Smartie in the middle.
Okay.
It's so good. Yeah, that one's
Yummy.
probably my favorite. So I'm sure my my blood is probably made of those cookies, all the sugar that's in those cookies. But they were real
Delish.
good. They were
Mm,
real good.
mm.
But yeah, so I guess that kind of brings us in the topic of this episode, connection, not the cookies. Although my sister has said that if we ever wanted to do a baking segment here, that she'd be more than welcome or more than willing to come in and do that. So maybe
Oh,
I told her maybe for a future episode.
baking. Yes, I love it.
Yeah. Anyways, so yeah, I guess as I was reflecting on the topic of connection, I really recognize that it looks different for me these days. Like I think in different periods of my life, it has looked different in each period. And so, but it kind of always has been a theme. So it looked different, but it kind of always was like lingering, hanging out in the background. And I think that's because for me, anyways, the opposite of lonely is connection. And so, yeah, it just really makes sense for connection to also be something that I've had to really work on. Um, and that's really where I guess my journey with connection started, I guess. Yeah, like when I wanted to have a better relationship with the feeling of loneliness, I had to work with the opposite of that. And so for me, I'm really like a get to the root kind of person.
Mm.
So like I can hear like something I should do, or I could hear like this is how it is, but I'm like, why? I always have been like that as a kid, teenager, early adult, even into now. And so yeah, I guess that's really where I started. I started, reading a bunch of stuff on like on connection and trying to figure out like, hey, like why is it so important for not only me, but I think, yeah, people like humans in general. And so we as humans are just really interesting. Like we're just really interesting biologically, physiologically, psychologically. So yeah, when I started looking into, I guess, why connection is kind of like where I started. And this is what I learned, or more or less what I took from it. Like I'm not an expert. I'm not a scientist or a doctor or anything like that. This information is just my interpretation of what I learned. I feel like I should say that for like legal purposes or something. But, anyways, what I took from getting to know the why was really about our makeup as humans. And we are, I guess, we're social beings by nature, right? Like that's in our biology as humans is to be social. And what I learned, I remember reading this is a while ago, but I remember reading this thing that said positive relationships or connections, I think they're like both the same, help us to be able to regulate our emotions, and they provide us, I guess, with like a little bit of a buffer um to like help us against the stressors in our life, I guess.
Mm.
And so we're wired to seek that social connection because of that. And
Mm.
so, not to get too deep into this stuff, but our brain's reward system, I guess, releases that good shit, right? Like the oxytocin, the dopamine, when we are engaging or when we're engaged in those positive social connections. And so for me, it was the psychological and emotional component of connection that stood out. Typically, like everything else that I read or that I work on or whatever, it's always the psychology behind it or the emotional impact that really stands out. And this time, particularly around, I guess, loneliness and its effects, right? So,
Right.
yeah, so I also read something really interesting that said in the absence of meaningful connections, and I think they called it something like I have it written here somewhere, but yeah, chronic loneliness. um it was said to have the same negative effects on health as smoking like 15 cigarettes a day.
Wow.
um, Now, disclaimer, this was also a few years ago, so like when I was looking into all this stuff, but who knows if it still stands. But honestly, I think I still believe that. Like, excuse me. Um, yeah, I think I still believe that. I know that it
Yeah.
has profound impacts on health, right? And so I was also a smoker at that time. So I guess really in terms of health, both physically, emotionally, yeah, just probably not great. Probably worse than all the sugar I have running through my veins now from Christmas cookies.
Mm.
Um, And so I guess what I wanted, like the point of that was to say like the impact is really severe, right? And I
Yeah.
don't think that I don't think that we talk about it much, and I don't think that we talk enough about it, I guess. That connection is important. And what I believe to be more important is meaningful connection.
Right.
Um, I think we connect with people like all of the time. So if it's at the grocery store, dropping kids off at school, commenting on something on Facebook, like, but are those meaningful connections?
Mm.
And I think the thing here also to recognize is that meaningful connections, I think, will be different, right? For you, it'll be different for me, it'll be different for people listening. So just yeah, it's subjective. And I guess my first question to you, Tiff, would be what do you think makes a connection meaningful? I guess.
Yeah. Well, first of all, like I share your uh, insatiable curiosity. I share that why, needing to know the why, and it's like you can give it to me, and that could be the exact right answer, but until I understand it for myself in my own brain, it's. I drove a lot of teachers crazy. I was even told as an adult with that. But no, what you're talking about loneliness, I remember watching a TED talk, and I do not remember the doctor who was giving the talk, but he was talking about the four like most fatal things for humans, and one of the things was loneliness. And he said, because when we get in that state of loneliness, our brain starts to perceive things in a very different way. And he was giving this example of, oh gosh, he had a twin brother and they always called each other on their birthday. And so his birthday came and he had been feeling really lonely. He had wanted to get home and he couldn't, and his family was in Europe. Anyway, long story short, he waited around all day for his brother to call. His
Mm,
brother didn't call. And so he was devastated. He's like, what's the point? Like I feel so lonely. Anyway, the next day he realizes his phone had been unplugged from the wall. So this is, I guess, back in a time where we were using that.
yeah.
And as soon as he plugged his phone in, basically his phone rang and it was his brother on the other line. He's like, where were you yesterday? Like, what did I? And he's like, oh, I thought you didn't want to talk to me. He said, so you didn't pick up the phone to call me? And it just
Mm,
really sunk in because that loneliness was telling him such a narrative about nobody wants to be in contact with me. No one, so that he didn't even have the thought like, oh, I could bridge the connection.
mm-hmm.
And that just hit me on so many levels. I can see.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, how true is that? So I can only imagine the detrimental impact that loneliness has on our whole well-being. Like, anyway, that just came up for me. But meaningful connection, to answer your question. Um, I think in order for it to be meaningful and in order for it to matter, I need to be seen and heard. And I need to see and hear another. And that means that the whole picture, the whole of me is allowed at the table. And
Mm,
that doesn't mean I need to show all the parts of me in one interaction, but that who I am showing up as in that moment, we are connecting to that person. We are present. I think that's the other piece, is that we
mm,
are really present with each other. Um, and for me, that goes a bit deeper and it fosters this sense of belonging. Because if I can connect with you here in this moment, then I also feel like I belong in this moment. And yes, we need to belong to ourselves, I believe. But yeah, also the belonging we can feel when we're in community. And um, yeah, I just think there's something so beautiful about that because true connection, meaningful connection for me fosters my authenticity. It really allows that the parts of me that sometimes I keep really closed off to really come out and play. And so yeah, I don't think I have anything more in depth to say about that, but yeah, just what is meaningful is when we can see and hear another and maybe even have understanding in there too. Some understanding thrown in the mix.
yeah, like that. Yeah, so yeah, thanks for sharing that story, especially because I was like, oh wow. Yeah, that is pretty, yeah, that's really impactful, right? Like what that internal dialogue that I think we tell ourselves when we're lacking whatever it is that we need, right? Whether it's connection, whether it's like happiness, whether like whatever that thing is. Yeah, when we're lacking that, the stories that we tell ourselves about that, um, yeah, our ability to make that stuff up is just like, yeah, it's interesting and also, um kind of sad that
Yeah.
we do that as well, right? Um, and then you mentioned something about presence, and actually like throughout I'm yeah, throughout this whole kind of like when I was like looking into things and like what are the questions I want to ask, what's important for me to talk about. Presence was something that I don't think that I even considered until you just mentioned that. So yeah,
Mm.
really just really thinking about that. And for those who see me, I always grab a pen and paper because I have to take notes because I don't remember I don't remember things if I don't write them down. But I did write that down because I think yeah, I think there's going to be something to reflect on even after this about presence because I think that's a really important component to meaningful connection. I agree with you on that one.
Mm.
And one of the other things I was also just as a side note, I guess, is, connection is such a large topic. Like there's so many different things that we can talk about when it comes to connection. So I think this is, yeah, just the intro, just like a
Yeah.
little piece of that connection pie, I guess. And
Mm.
yeah, more to come. But anyways, yeah, so to go back, I guess, to meaningful connections, I think one of the things as you were talking that came up for me was around vulnerability, right? Like it was kind of a very similar conversation that we shared
Yeah.
and in a couple episodes ago now. And as I was kind of framing out this episode and how it might look, I was re-listening to it. I know I sent you a picture of me
Yes.
working over here and listening to that in the background because I do believe that a willingness of or a willingness to, I guess, expose our true self helps us to connect.
Yeah.
And for those who missed that episode, it's episode 3. So please go and have a listen if you'd like to hear more about vulnerability. But yeah, we crave the feeling of being truly seen and accepted
Yeah.
by others, right? And I think those two things definitely, for me, anyways, is the core of a meaningful connection to be seen and accepted.
I share that. Yeah.
So to go back a little bit, I guess, and just yeah, in thinking about your reflection on meaningful connection and your thoughts around that, I'd like to hear more about, in your experience or your opinion, I guess, about the difference between being around people, and being connected to people.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually love thinking about this. Maybe that's weird, but like there are many spaces that I go where I don't necessarily care to be connected to people because I'm
Mm,
connected to doing something. So it's like I'm getting my groceries. I don't need to be connected to everyone in the grocery store as I move through the grocery store, as an
mhm,
example. Um, but there are the places and the spaces where I seek it. And I think and those are the people that I choose to keep in my life on a day to day, regular basis. Or maybe not day to day, but even the ones that I choose to have a seat at my table, so to speak. And I can't expect and demand things from people, but I do love to truly know the people that I choose to keep around. And I'm going to give an example of what I have a connection with a friend, and it goes without saying that every single time the other person is thinking about the other one, a message comes in.
mm,
And it's a whatever. And I'm like, that is so deeply connected on a level that is not seen, or we don't even live in the same place.
mm,
So,
mm,
so, and it's like, and the message was to me today, I am always, it never ceases to amaze me how this happens every time. And I was like, I know, it's just crazy. So, and that for me is because we allow our vulnerable and authentic parts to show up. Our hearts are so open to one another, and we're really able to share in the depth of that connection together. But when the people that are around me on a regular basis, and maybe they're going through hard stuff and like nothing, it's not all black and white, but when they're in the room and there's a disconnection, there's a severing of the connection that once was or that was there, it just, I think you and I were talking about this, right? It's just like really, for me, amps up the feelings of loneliness and like a painful isolation, I think. And so, yeah, to be connected, I think there's open hearts, there's generous assumptions for the other, there's acceptance of who they are. and that comes flaws and all because we're all human, and we all have these things. And when that's not present, it's like, well, what is happening that there's this severing of disconnection? Like, why is there a reason? um yeah, and so yeah, I just I feel like I've went around the question. I'm not even sure I've answered the question, but yeah, just the difference is I can be in a room full of people, but do you know me? Do I know you?
Mm.
Like we can share all the space in the world, but like, and I noticed myself doing this over the past couple of days through the New Year stuff. I didn't want to know what the weather was like outside when people, and these were a lot of new people I was meeting. I I just watched myself in, like, I'm watching myself as I'm doing it. I'm like, look at you asking all these questions. And once upon a time, I'd be afraid to really lean in and ask all of these, like, what are maybe perceived as more interrogative questions. Like, I'm like,
Right.
well, what do you like about that? And what's your thing about? But I want to know you. Like, that is my attempt to want to know you beyond what you curate for me to see, you know? And it was mostly met with a lot of positive, like, oh, like a lot of eyes lighting up when I was like asking these questions. And I was like, it has to be really intentional too, right? Like, I
Mhm.
had a lot of intention behind my questions as I was talking to people. So anyway, yeah, I just want to come back. Yeah, we can share space, but do I know you is the question that comes up. Do you know me? No, and without it, are we connected at all?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think that that's so true, right? Like you can share space, I think, with like hundreds of people and not feel connected to any of them.
Yeah,
But in a space of like one person or one other person, right? You feel a connection like so meaningful that, you know, maybe you haven't felt it before or something like that, right? So it kind of goes back to this quantity versus like quality thing that I've yeah also kind of really thought about a lot in my adult life. Later, my I'm not gonna can't say later adult life yet. I know I'm not in late adulthood, but my most recent experience of being an adult, because in my early adulthood, it was very much about this quantity, right? It was very much
right,
like the more I people I had around, the less lonely I would feel. And yeah, that's not true if there's no meaningful connection, right?
right.
Yeah, I think just really, really powerful what you shared. And also I resonate with that a little bit. Like, I travel a lot for work, and there are some times where you meet coworkers kind of like for the first time, right? I work virtually, so we get to like the space that you share virtually, and we'll get there eventually in this, like, to talk more about that, but the space you share virtually is just very different than, like face to face.
Yeah.
But I recently took a trip a couple of months ago with a coworker who I'd never met, actually never even had an online conversation with. So just, yeah, really, really new person. And we had to sit in a vehicle for like 6 hours together, to get to a place. And then we had to spend another 6 hours to get back to another place. And so for me, I was kind of dreading that. Like, I'm not going to lie. I was like, oh my goodness, like, how am I going to be able to spend 6 hours in a vehicle with a person I do not know, I've never met before? And yeah, just I was really dreading it, because like you, I want to see people, right? Like and not all of the time, like I have to do this balancing act sometimes of
Yeah,
like, okay, like when is it actually like achievable for one? When is it really important for another? But when do I have to understand, like, I'm not going to feel that connection to every single person that I come across in my life, right? So
for
it's
sure.
about finding the balance. Um, but yeah, anyways, when so we started off this trip very like, um how could I say, like, face value kind of questions, like really surface level questions, right? Like, so you're from here, where are you from, where do you live, or like all of these things. And then yeah, something kind of like we connected on our love for podcasts. So we were both very interested in podcasts, and some of them were very similar. Some of them were very different. This person talked a lot of or listened to a lot of podcasts around politics. And so for me, I'm usually that person who strays away from any political conversation. Sometimes it's because I don't keep up enough with politics and different things that um I don't feel like I have enough to have an opinion,
Mm.
right? Because I'm like, I don't really know enough about that. I can't say how I feel about it because I don't know enough about it. Anyways, I'm a true crime podcast girly for sure. Um, but anyways, what once we kind of got past that like surface level stuff and we established, okay, a connection, right? It was a connection on something we both enjoyed doing.
Mm.
The 6 hours just like flew by because all of a sudden I'm in a space where I got to learn stuff. And I think that other person also got to learn things. Like I was sharing about one of my favorite podcasts is called Morbid. Shout out to the morbid girlies, the morbid weirdos. But I love that podcast. And so I would share things that I've learned from there. I would share, like maybe like really case specific or maybe just like certain things that they kind of like share in their episodes. And in turn, I was learning all of this stuff about like politics, about senators, about all in American politics, which I have no idea, like I don't know a lot about at all. Anyways, and so it was just really interesting to me to see the connection that came out of something that A, I was dreading, B, I never would have had an opportunity to do
Mm.
before if I wasn't in, that place and at that time. And so I think for me, being surrounded by people and feeling emotionally, or I guess for me, spiritually disconnected is difficult, right? So those spaces where I feel connected to somebody by something is important.
Mm.
And also, I think we form our identity in relationship to others in a way, right? Like we form who we are through being in relation. And so we want to feel, and I heard you say these words, understood, valued, connected, because it helps us define who we are, right? Or who
Yeah.
we want to be or who we desire to be. And without others to kind of like reflect back our thoughts, feelings, and experiences, I think it can be really difficult to understand ourselves fully.
Yeah.
Um, and I think like when we feel seen or understood, or maybe even like recognized, maybe like even genuinely recognized by others, it strengthens our sense of self as well. And I guess when other people see us for who truly are, we've talked about this before, but we kind of experience a little bit of validation in that too, right? Like we
Yeah,
feel validated.
for sure.
And that I think helps solidify our self-concept of who we think we are when we feel acknowledged and appreciated. So anyways, with all of that, that kind of went on a little bit of a tangent, but when you shared about that connection piece, it reminded me of that. So when you said feeling seen or understood or connected, how do you think those things contribute to our well-being or our sense of purpose or our identity?
Yeah, that's a that is a good question. I yeah, I think I had a really before leading up to this recording, I had a really interesting 48 hours. And I even fired off the message to a couple of people and I was like, I feel so different. But I had been hermiting. So like to talk about what you were talking about, like how it strengthens our sense of self. I had been very hermited for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
Last episode, navigating difficult seasons, that's where I was, and I was very much in my storm.
Mm-hmm.
And when I stepped out, it's like I left a cloak of something that wasn't mine anymore. But I stepped into these experiences over the past 48 hours, and so bear with me because it's all new.
Mm-hmm.
But I was able to really stand in those spaces, and I saw what I would have normally done, and that was shrunk to fit in. So I think, yeah, I think there's two edges of it because yes, people bounce back and we allow to see ourselves, but when there's trauma about being ourselves, oftentimes I'm taking on other people's things and behaviors that aren't mine, and then I hold them real close and make them part of my identity, but it's like an ill-fitting coat all the time. It doesn't fit me. And I think I had just such a different experience because I met old friends I hadn't seen in a long time, brand new people I had never met at all. And I was like 100% okay to be there as myself. I saw how they were. I also felt how I used to respond to the various situations, but I was really able to hold my own. So I guess I just bring that up because, yes, I did feel very strengthened in who I was, what I was embodying in that moment.
Mhm.
But the flip side is for me, a lot of the time, it actually added things to my identity that wasn't mine because I didn't have a process to discern, like, oh, that doesn't fit for me because I was so desperate to fit in.
Mm.
But because of that, I had such a deep sense of belonging in all the spaces I was in the last 48 hours. And I've been craving this for a long time. So I was like, wow, is this how it feels? Like I feel
Mhm.
brand new. Like I feel brand new. It's yeah, so just I don't know if I can answer your question directly, but I definitely notice the opposite when I'm doing a lot of needing it to fit in. And okay, no, to come back though, to come back to your question, when I'm in the spaces where I feel truly seen and understood, I guess I don't feel the need so much to take on those ill-fitting coats and
Mhm.
to dress myself in them. Because again, it comes back to that acceptance and I belong here as I authentically am. I am allowed to be me and you're allowed to be you. But I've been in a lot of spaces where that's not true, where you are the authentic one, you stick out like a sore thumb and it's like you don't belong here because it ruffles the feathers in other people or the things that they're not looking at in themselves, right? And that's a whole
Yeah.
other conversation. But yeah, so it has both taken away, but also I have recently felt that very strengthened sense of identity as I stood as I wanted to be in the space with other people.
Yeah, like yeah, thanks for sharing. Like what a beautiful moment, right? Like you see you've been grasping, I've been looking for this for a
Yeah.
long time. And yeah, I think just a really beautiful moment to get to experience that, right? Takes a lot of
Mm-hmm.
work and it takes a lot of commitment, I think, to do enough of this inner work to get to a place where we're like,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like I belong here.
Yeah.
And here means here, like not in our
Yes.
phys. And for those who are just listening, I pointed to my chest, like here, like in ourselves, like in my heart, right? In my spirit versus whatever the external environment looks like. Yeah, so I'm really happy. I'm really happy that you got to experience
Mm,
that.
thank you. Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, so I guess yeah, to go back to experiencing that deep sense of belonging, um, comes confidence, I think, comes security, perhaps, when we
Yeah.
feel seen and understood. And I go back to, I'll say, meaningful connection with ourselves, right? Because I think you
Right.
made a really good point. Like you made a really good point that regardless of the things or the people that we interact with, if we feel meaningful connection with ourselves, then we kind of we're okay in those spaces, and then we're also to be okay to be like, I don't think I need to be in that space anymore, right? Like it didn't
Yeah.
work for me, or this was an awesome space to be, and I need more of this, or I want more of this, right? And so I guess it makes me think about different dynamics of connection. So connection to self, connection to others, connection to family, to our work, to our like all of these things. And I guess when I think back to my own experiences, like growing up, as an early adult, like a teenager, I guess, really, I think how connection was viewed really did influence how I considered connection or what I considered connection to be.
Right.
So from things like something that really stands out for me, like avoidance versus confrontation. So I think in spaces where conflict is suppressed or conflict is avoided, I guess, we're less likely to like not feel safe to
Right.
express those difficult emotions, right? Or we have issues addressing things like really directly. Um, and so I think sometimes this can result in, I don't want to say fake, but like maybe a superficial
Yeah.
connection. So it's like something where it's still underlying, like there's an unresolved tension. Oh, I just hit my mic. Like there's an unresolved tension that kind of feels like underneath the surface, but we're still like connecting in what do you want for dinner? Or it's like we're not addressing that conflict. Um, and the connection then just seems not real because it's like, but remember that thing that we had an issue about? We're not talking about that.
Mm.
Yeah, and it's just always kind of there, but expected to like really move on from that. And we're not
Yeah.
going to talk about it or not resolve it. And so I also think about something like when this was like all coming together and I was like, what are the things like what that makes connection and how do our what we just talked about the external environments, how does that influence like how we look at connections? I like I guess how can I like gender, I guess, is one of the things that came up for me. And so I very much acknowledge that as well, I'll talk about men and women. So men, are kind of sometimes expected to suppress more of those emotions. And I'm not a man, and I don't mean to speak on behalf of men, but I could certainly see how this could have an effect on forming a deep, like emotional connection,
Right.
right? Or perhaps yeah, like being reluctant to seek that connection or
Mm.
seek support or whatever, so really just seeking or developing a deep connection. And then I am a woman so I can speak on behalf of myself as a woman. I find it really easy to form nurturing emotional bonds like
Mm.
with people, right? Like either professionally, personally, I just find it really easy to do that. It's my experience. Sometimes, though, I think what happens is that this puts pressure on me to put others' needs before my own needs.
Mm.
And I like if I think back to burnout and what resulted in a burnout for me, I think that that was probably one of those things, the really nurturing side of me
Yeah.
forming these deep connections. And currently, what leads to um, feelings of resentment for me is this nurturing part where I want the connection and I can establish it,
Mm.
but I don't always get then what I need in return.
Right.
So I guess yeah, I don't know if that made sense. But just
That's
trying to get
fine.
all of my thoughts out here. But I guess I'd like to hear from you in your experience, like how connection was viewed from people around you. Um, if you think that impacted how connection looked for you, or yeah, and if you do, like what might that impact have been, or just any thoughts around the impact or any thoughts around connection.
Yeah. Um, yeah, you were talking about the avoid. I hadn't thought about this at all, so just wanted to like touch on that. But yeah, how avoidance was how conflict was managed, or in my experience, avoidance or blowups. So there
Mm,
was it just went back and forth. Um, and so what I learned from an early age, and nobody said this to me. This is just something that I've learned in doing work as an adult, that like being connected to somebody truly is painful. That means
mm,
pain, that means suffering, that means highs and lows and leaving and abandonment and a lot of things that I was very nervous to for a long time to allow people to see me or to be in a meaningful connection. So I would unintentionally, probably subconsciously is probably the word I want to look for, reattract these types of connections that were familiar. But I can't say it was much like what you were saying, like it was very surface. There was no depth there. There was no true intimacy or vulnerability, or it was highs and lows, emotional dysregulation. It was,
yeah.
like just a lot of pain and chaos. It really was. And I remember, yeah, just I feel like how I would like to describe how it was is like connection really functioned like an addiction for me for a really long time.
Mm,
I was addicted to not having to be by myself. It kind of taps into that loneliness, right?
yeah,
But it didn't mean anything and it drained me in the exact same way because like you're saying your needs aren't met, right?
yeah,
Yeah, my needs weren't met because A, I couldn't communicate them. So like how could anybody meet them? I didn't know what they were myself. I just was miserable. And yeah, B, I wasn't really interested in being in the depth with anybody else either. So like it's not like I couldn't meet them for other people either. And so yeah, when I first started to find more connection with myself, which I believe is where I had to shift the narrative like of how I was going to show up, is like, okay, if I can connect with myself more deeply, then I can lean in here. And it wasn't conscious. That's not like I was consciously doing that, but in hindsight, like I see that process a little bit more clearly. But yeah, to learn how to even connect, like that was so foreign. Like I don't like it was it yeah, I knew how to be reactive. I knew how to be, yeah, all these things. But yeah, to be truly connected and to like rewrite what that means for me. Yeah. And so it had a very like detrimental impact for a long time, I would say. And it allowed me to continue running from myself.
mm,
And so, yeah, when I think about it, when I slowed down and stopped running from myself, is when not easily I was able to start leaning into these spaces where I could have genuine connection with another and really have that nurturance and that compassion and care for one another in a way that I'm not burning myself out to give.
yeah,
And also because there's some replenishment on both sides. It's like, and it doesn't have to be 50-50, and it doesn't have to be even like the same give and take, but just knowing there's also that as well, I think is really important for me in a connection and something that I've grown into. So yeah, I don't know if I fully answered your second time I've said that today, but I don't know if I fully answered your question, but that is what else comes up for me. Just how, yeah, connection really functioned like an addiction for a long time. That had a big impact.
yeah, yeah. And I think you, excuse me, I think you did. Yeah, I think you did answer it beautifully. Because the other part is too, I think the more that we know, the more we think about it. Like even having this conversation right now, like there are so many things I'm like, wow, I haven't like considered that, like with the presence, and now like with the connection serving as like an addiction, and like, wow, like that is also, yeah, I can resonate with that, right? It's like it
Mm,
doesn't matter what it looks like, it doesn't matter like who it is or when or where. I just it was like I needed it, and like
yeah.
that was it. And all of the things that yeah, all the things that I think now that considers or that I consider a meaningful connection, I'd be yeah, I'd probably even put a bet that none of those things would have been like achieved in those connections, right? Or yeah,
Mm,
in those spaces.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and it's interesting too. Like I was thinking about, and I know I talked a little bit about this earlier, about like being in a virtual world. And so there's this new, I don't know if you'd call it like theory or like what it is, but a quote unquote new thing, I guess, is something called social prescribing.
Okay.
And I think we might have talked about this like before. Yeah. So it's just really interesting. Like when I think about even my own home community, and other like indigenous communities that have, quite literally, this has been a way of life for like a really long time, like forever. We've done this like really naturally, right? So spending time with each other, supporting each other, really having a strong sense of community, I guess, and sharing spaces. And even if we don't always get along all of the time, like there's just still something that makes us like show up, right, for each
Mm,
other. And I'm not going to give a history lesson here. I can save that for another time. But our world has drastically changed in many ways since then, right? And
yeah.
so as we spend more time on Facebook or TikTok, or as our workplaces turn virtual, I think this does impact connection, right? And I've done
Mm,
some looking into something called modern isolation. And while isolation itself, I don't think is a new experience for like us as humans, but I do think the way I guess that it manifests now is very different than maybe previous generations. And so, be, like in some ways, I do think that we're now more connected than ever, right? We have everyone, everything at our fingertips, and like how like that. makes us really connected. But in
Yeah.
other ways, I think the quality and the depth of our connections, the meaningful connections that we've spent time talking about are harder and harder to find in those virtual spaces. Sometimes I couldn't can't say always, but sometimes. And so
Yeah.
I don't think that means that we still don't need or that we don't crave the meaningful connection.
Right.
So I guess in talking about these societal shifts, kind of like into like virtual kind of spaces, things like that, do you think that our craving for connection has changed?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the answer is yes, and I don't feel like I have the no knowledge to know exactly why. But it kind of comes back to like what I think about. So I'll speak from my own experience because that feels like the only thing that I can credibly say in this space with this question. But is like I'm okay because what we see in a lot of those digital platforms is highlight reels of people's lives. Not always, again, nothing is black and white, but a lot of the time we see highlights, which is great. I am happy to share in the celebration of other people's highlights,
Mm-hmm.
but we're only seeing one side, and I'm still left. I have craved depth since I was a young girl.
Mm-hmm.
It's that why, it's that wanting to know things more, just more intimately, more deeply. And yeah, I don't get to see the realness of what people, so it's so superficial. It doesn't have a lot of value. Like, yeah, I love to cheer people on, but I also want to know. I want to know your whole picture. Not your whole picture, but like, just a broader picture of what is real for you. And I do see what happens when people put complaints or like they're venting and people are like, "Oh my God, there they go venting." It's like, "Well, hey, that's truly how they're feeling right now."
Yeah.
So, whatever. Um, but yeah, I know that when COVID hit, I was very grateful for the digital landscape for connection because it was like, I have nothing. So that feels good. But there has been nothing pushing me more for community than since we've moved from the COVID space and where everything is virtual and digital. Because sharing physical space with another, for me, I can really enjoy. And I love voice notes. I love FaceTime calls because I can see and I can hear the people that I love,
Mm-hmm.
but I would give all that up to be in the space with the person and share that physical space together because I can't put they just don't go together. And so I've noticed for me over the past where since we've really moved super digital, just that craving for in-person deep connections. And yeah, because it does lead to an isolating feeling. It's like, oh, I'm over. And then the other fallout is like, now I see everything that you're doing that's great, and I don't know anything that's hard. And I'm like, my life sucks.
So
Have to
true.
be very conscious of that, right? Like, that's to know that people are sharing what they feel proud to share and such. But yeah, so I don't have too many other thoughts on that, but I just know it has pushed me back into wanting community that much more.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because I think like the craving, even though it looks different, but like our desire to want to be connected, I think we still have that, right? But now we get
Yeah.
it in different ways. Like it shows up in different ways. Um, yeah, yeah, so true. I think that could be like a whole other whole other episode.
Conversation.
Yeah. So yeah, so I guess one final question on that note of cultivating connection. If you could offer a tip um of an actionable step, something that people could do
Yes.
that might cultivate some more of that meaningful connection in their lives, what might that be?
I really love this question. And I think there's a lot of answers that can
Mm,
be shared, but the one that I want to share is active listening. I think if you are looking to cultivate a connection and maybe you don't know how to, or maybe you think you're an active listener, and what I mean by active listening, if you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, Tiffany, is listening to understand the other and not to respond with your own stuff. And
mm,
when we can sit to really listen to understand, we ask questions differently. We hear things differently. We're not just like, oh, da, da, da. And don't get me wrong, there's a space to relate to. I'm not saying that. But when I really learned how to lean into really listening to what somebody's saying to me, there's a lot of trust and safety that can be cultivated in that space to really lean into a stronger connection. So that is what I would say, I think. What
yeah, I
about you?
love that. I love that because what I find in our conversations especially is like we hear a question, or like we're like listening to the person and we hear a question, we're like, okay, and we're like try to answer it, because I do believe that we're so intently listening to each other that we're like, okay, now it's my turn to say something. So I think when I like even listen back on episodes, we're like, okay, I think I understand, or I think I've got everything here. But yeah, like coming from that space of listening versus or listening to understand versus listening to respond, I think is really profound. And oftentimes that's probably why my thoughts are like, this feels really jumbled, and this like is just going to come out in this way. um but I think that that is yeah, I think that that's meaningful, and something that I appreciate in our conversations anyways.
Totally.
Um, for me, I would say I'm gonna go right back to that face-to-face like interactions, man. Like if there's one thing that I've really been trying to do, mostly because like I said, yeah, I work virtually full time as well. Every opportunity that I get to spend with people, I'm like, yep, I'm there volunteering. Whether it's going for a coffee, if it's like, hey, I need someone to look after my dog, hey, do you want to go for a drive? Like I'm in, like I'm in to do all of those things, because yeah, so just kind of stepping outside of comfort zones, and stepping outside of um yeah, life, like whatever
Mm,
things I have going on, to establish some face-to-face time, I think would be mine.
yeah, great tip.
All right, I think yeah, I think we're gonna wind down. I have no idea what the time is on this this recording. I will deal with that later. And so as we do wind down, I guess I just want to ask who might be listening. I'm going to ask a question of, when was the last time that you felt full of connection, and what was it that made that experience feel meaningful for
Mm,
to you or for you? And yeah, I'd love it if you share your thoughts in the comments, like here, or head to our Facebook and Instagram, or both, whatever works. But just leave us some insights on what connection looks like for you and what makes it meaningful. Just really want to get a sense of that from whoever might be listening. And just as a final reminder that you are worthy of a meaningful connection,
mm.
if that's something that you value. Um, and yeah, I think that's it. We're so grateful that you've tuned in for another episode. And until next time, stay soulful, everyone.
Thanks for tuning into Soulful. We hope you found something meaningful to carry with you on your journey. And if you enjoyed today's episode and want to show your support, we invite you to subscribe, share the podcast, and leave a review wherever you listen.
And if you're eager for more, you can connect with us on Instagram and Facebook at Soulful the Podcast for additional content and updates. Until next time, stay soulful.